Sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places, when your heart has given up hope of finding something real. Miss Cordelia Vaughan thought she knew exactly what her life would be: predictable, proper, and utterly empty of genuine affection. At the town's labor auction, she bought a gentle giant cowboy named Bo Rig and his stubborn donkey Jubilee as a joke. She expected a few days of amusement. Instead, she found a man who fixed her broken fence with care and treated her family like they mattered. Jubilee stole biscuits and somehow knew when her heart was heavy. But what secret could destroy everything they were building together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sundown Bluff stretched along the valley floor like a woman's skirt spread wide for dancing, all dusty streets and wooden sidewalks that creaked under the weight of commerce and dreams. The town had grown fat on silver strikes and cattle drives, drawing folks from every corner of creation who figured they could scratch out something better than what they'd left behind. At the heart of it all sat the Vaughan family's brick banking house, solid as the bedrock beneath it, with windows that caught the morning light like watchful eyes. Miss Cordelia Vaughan adjusted her pearl earrings, a nervous habit her mother had tried to break with little successes. She watched the street below from her bedroom window. 24 years old and still unmarried, she represented what polite society called a situation. Not because she lacked beauty. Her dark hair caught auburn highlights in the sun, and her green eyes held intelligence that made lesser men uncomfortable. Not because she lacked money. The Vaughan name carried weight from Denver to San Francisco, and her dowry could finance a small railroad. The situation was simpler and more complicated than either. Cordelia had opinions, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. "You're brooding again," came a voice from the doorway. Sarah, her 16-year-old sister, possessed all the romantic notions that Cordelia had systematically abandoned over the years. Where Cordelia saw calculation in every suitor's smile, Sarah saw possibility. Where Cordelia heard the rustle of banknotes in every declaration of love, Sarah heard heartbeats. "I'm observing," Cordelia corrected, not turning from the window. "There's a difference between brooding and thinking, though I suspect most people in this town wouldn't recognize either." Sarah settled into the chair by Cordelia's vanity, her fingers trailing over the silver brushes and crystal bottles that spoke of wealth and refinement. "Margaret Henley says you turned down another proposal yesterday. That makes 7 this year. 8. You missed Harold Beckwith in February. Though calling what he did a proposal might be generous, he mostly stammered about his prospects while staring at my neckline." "Cordelia!" Sarah's shock was genuine, which only proved how much innocence remained in their household. "You can't speak of such things." "Why not? Should I pretend that half the men who court me aren't calculating whether my inheritance is worth overlooking my sharp tongue?" Cordelia finally turned from the window, her green eyes flashing with frustration that had been building for months. "Or should I act surprised when they lose interest, the moment I express an opinion stronger than whether the weather is pleasant?" The truth was that Cordelia had grown weary of the game. Each suitor arrived with the same playbook: flowers, empty compliments, and careful conversation that avoided any topic that might reveal actual thoughts or feelings. They wanted a beautiful ornament for their arm, a well-bred mother for their children, and a silent partner in their social climbing. None of them seemed particularly interested in Cordelia herself. "Father says you're being too particular," Sarah offered, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely agree with their father's assessment. "Father says many things. Most of them concern themselves with maintaining the family's position in society, rather than anyone's actual happiness." Cordelia moved to her wardrobe, selecting a riding dress in deep blue that complemented her coloring without being too dramatic. "Speaking of father, where is our dear patriarch this morning?" "Downstairs with the family portrait artist. He's having mother's likeness retouched again." Sarah's voice carried the weight of understanding that passed between sisters. Their mother had died 3 years earlier, and their father's insistence on maintaining her painted presence in their formal portrait struck both daughters as more performance than grief. The Vaughan family portrait dominated the main parlor, a massive oil painting that served as both decoration and declaration. Charles Vaughan stood behind his seated wife, his hand possessively placed on her shoulder, while his 3 children arranged themselves according to age and importance. Cordelia occupied the place of honor at her mother's right hand, with Sarah beside her and their youngest brother Thomas completing the composition. The artist had captured the family's prosperity in every detail, from the quality of their clothing to the symbolic books and papers that spoke of education and business acumen. What the portrait couldn't capture was the growing tension that had filled their household since their mother's passing. Charles Vaughan had always been a controlling man, but grief had sharpened his need to manage every aspect of his family's lives. Thomas, at 12, mostly escaped by virtue of his youth and gender. Sarah's romantic nature made her easier to handle. She wanted the things her father wanted for her, at least in general outline. Cordelia presented the problem. "You should see the dress Mrs. Patterson is having made for the summer festival," Sarah continued, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "Yards and yards of yellow silk, with lace that came all the way from New Orleans. She's convinced that young Reverend Morrison will finally declare himself if she makes the right impression. Mrs. Patterson is 60 if she's a day, and Reverend Morrison is more interested in her late husband's donation to the church fund than her yellow silk." Cordelia's frankness sometimes bordered on cruelty, but she'd learned that honest observations often revealed more about people's motivations than polite fiction. "You're terrible," Sarah laughed, though she didn't disagree. "But speaking of the festival, you do remember about the labor auction this afternoon." The summer festival had become Sundown Bluff's premier social event, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and providing local businesses with their most profitable week of the year. Along with the usual festivities, dancing, games, contests of skill and chance, the festival featured traditions that spoke to the community's practical nature. The labor auction ranked among the most popular. Originally conceived as a way for down-on-their-luck cowboys and drifters to earn honest wages, the labor auction had evolved into part necessity, part entertainment. Men who needed work could offer their services for specific periods, a week, a month, sometimes longer, while townspeople bid for their labor. The terms were always honest: fair wages for fair work, with room and board provided. What made it entertaining was the unpredictability of who might end up working where, and how the temporary arrangements sometimes led to permanent changes in the community's social fabric. "I remember," Cordelia said, though she'd been planning to avoid the spectacle entirely. "Another opportunity for our neighbors to display their wealth while pretending to be charitable. Margaret says her mother is planning to bid on someone to help with their garden. The Henley place has gotten quite overgrown since their groundskeeper moved to California." Sarah's eyes held a speculative gleam that Cordelia recognized as dangerous. "She dared me to bid on someone too. Sarah, you don't need help with anything, and Father would have apoplexy if you brought a strange man into our household without his permission." "I wasn't thinking of me." Sarah's smile was pure mischief. "I was thinking of you." Cordelia set down her hairbrush with deliberate care. "Absolutely not. Think about it. You're always complaining that the men who court you are boring and predictable. Here's your chance to meet someone different. Someone who actually works for a living, instead of living off his family's name. Someone who's probably desperate enough to auction off his labor, which suggests either poor judgment or worse luck. Neither quality recommends itself for close association." But even as Cordelia voiced her objections, something about Sarah's suggestion intrigued her. Not the idea of bidding on a man that struck her as both demeaning and dangerous, but the underlying premise. What would it be like to interact with someone who hadn't calculated her worth down to the penny before introducing himself? Someone who might value competence over connections, character over capital. "Besides," Cordelia continued, "Father would never allow it. The Vaughan family doesn't participate in labor auctions. We donate money to worthy causes at appropriate times and in appropriate amounts. We don't engage in public spectacles that might diminish our standing in the community. Father doesn't have to know you're participating, not until afterward." Sarah's logic had the dangerous simplicity of youth. By then, what's done is done. And if you pick someone suitable, he might even approve. Cordelia found herself considering the possibility, despite her better judgment. The summer festival would draw crowds from every corner of the territory, including people she'd never met and might never see again. The anonymity appealed to her almost as much as the adventure. When had she last done something spontaneous? When had she last surprised herself? "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, hating how interested she sounded. "Come to the auction with Margaret and me. If someone interesting appears, bid on him. If not, we'll have witnessed some entertainment and can go watch the horseshoe competition instead." Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, and Cordelia felt her resistance weakening. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, Cordelia thought, but didn't voice the sentiment. Instead, she found herself nodding, already imagining the shocked faces of her social circle when news of her participation spread through town. The pearl earrings caught the light as she moved, tiny flashes of rebellion that seemed to approve of her decision. "1 week," she said finally. "If I do this, and I'm not saying I will, it would be for 1 week only, no longer." 1 week, Sarah agreed, though her smile suggested she expected considerably more drama than 7 days of labor would provide. Neither sister could have predicted how thoroughly one impulsive decision would reshape not just Cordelia's week, but the entire trajectory of her carefully planned life. The family portrait hanging in their parlor would soon welcome new members, and the Vaughan household would discover that sometimes the most precious acquisitions couldn't be purchased with money. They had to be earned with patience, kindness, and the courage to see past surface appearances to the heart beneath. The labor auction drew crowds like honey drew flies, filling the town square with a mixture of curiosity, commerce, and barely contained chaos. A wooden platform had been erected in front of the courthouse, decorated with bunting that snapped smartly in the afternoon breeze. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jeremiah Pike, who sold everything from livestock to farm equipment with equal enthusiasm, tested his voice with a few practice calls that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Cordelia stood with Margaret, Henley, and Sarah near the back of the gathering crowd, her heart beating faster than the occasion warranted. She'd chosen her second-best dress blue cotton with modest trim, wanting to blend into the crowd rather than announce her presence. The pearl earrings felt heavier than usual, as if they were trying to remind her of her proper place in society. "I still think this is madness," Margaret whispered, though her eyes sparkled with excitement. "What if someone recognizes you?" "Half the town is here," Cordelia replied, gesturing toward the familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. "Recognition seems inevitable. The question is whether anyone will care enough to mention it to Father." The first few lots proceeded predictably enough. Young men fresh off cattle drives offered their services for ranch work. Older hands sought employment that would carry them through the slow season, and a few craftsmen advertised specialized skills. The bidding was spirited but reasonable, with most workers going for fair wages to employers who clearly needed their services. Then Jeremiah Pike's voice boomed across the square. "Next lot is something special, folks. We've got Bo Rigg and his companion Jubilee, offering a week's honest work for room, board, and fair compensation." The crowd stirred with interest as 2 figures approached the platform. The man who climbed the steps moved with careful dignity, despite his obvious exhaustion. Bo Rigg stood 6 feet and 6 inches, if he stood an inch, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world and hands that spoke of hard work, honestly done. His dark hair needed cutting, his clothes showed wear, but everything about his bearing suggested a man who hadn't given up on himself, despite circumstances that had clearly tested his resolve. The real surprise came when his companion followed him onto the platform. Jubilee was a donkey of indeterminate age and definite opinions. She stood perhaps 3 feet high at her shoulders, with a coat that had once been brown but now showed patches of grey that suggested either advanced years or poor nutrition. Her ears were disproportionately large, even for a donkey, and her expression conveyed the sort of skeptical intelligence usually reserved for bank examiners and philosophy professors. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jeremiah continued with the smooth patter of a practiced salesman. Why would anyone bid on a man who comes with livestock? Well, let me tell you something about this particular partnership. Bo Rig has worked cattle from here to the Canadian border, can fix anything that's broken, and builds fence that'll last through the next ice age. As for Jubilee here, he gestured toward the donkey, who promptly sat down on the platform as if the entire proceeding bored her. She's got opinions about everything and isn't shy about sharing them. The crowd laughed, but Cordelia found herself studying the man rather than enjoying the entertainment. Bo Rig's face could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and weathered lines that spoke of years spent under the sun and stars. His eyes were grey as storm clouds, and when his gaze swept across the crowd, she felt something shift inside her chest. Here was a man who looked like he'd faced whatever life had thrown at him and kept standing. "What's the starting bid?" called out Tom Henderson, who owned the largest ranch in the county. $10 for the week, room and board included, Jeremiah announced. 15, Henderson countered immediately. 20, came a voice from the other side of the crowd. Cordelia watched as the bidding escalated, noting how Bo Rig's expression never changed, despite the fact that his immediate future was being decided by strangers. Jubilee, meanwhile, had begun investigating the platform with her nose, apparently searching for anything edible that previous lots might have dropped. $30, Henderson called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. 35, counted Mrs. Patterson, which surprised everyone since she lived alone and had no obvious need for manual labor. 40, Henderson shot back, clearly irritated. Something about the competitive edge in Henderson's voice bothered Cordelia. She'd heard that tone before, the sound of a man who viewed other people as property to be acquired rather than human beings deserving of respect. Bo Rig might need the work, but Henderson was the sort of employer who got his money's worth by grinding his workers down to nothing. $50, Mrs. Patterson called out, her voice trembling slightly with either excitement or fear. Henderson's face darkened. 60. 70, Mrs. Patterson replied, though she sounded less certain now. Cordelia felt Sarah's elbow in her ribs. Now would be a good time, her sister whispered urgently. I can't possibly. $80, Henderson announced with finality, clearly expecting to end the competition. Mrs. Patterson opened her mouth, then closed it again, defeat written across her features. Around the crowd, people began to nod approvingly. Henderson was known to be demanding but fair, and $80 represented excellent compensation for a week's work. Jeremiah Pike raised his gavel. $80 going once. $100. The words left Cordelia's mouth before she'd consciously decided to speak them. The entire crowd seemed to freeze, heads turning toward her voice, with expressions ranging from shock to amusement to outright disapproval. Did I hear correctly? Jeremiah asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. $100? Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what she'd done. $100 was more than some families saw in 3 months, an absurd sum for a week's labor from a man she'd never met. But something about Bo Rig's quiet dignity had called to her, and the thought of him working for Henderson, who was notorious for treating his employees like expensive tool shad, made the decision for her. You heard correctly, she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The crowd murmured with excitement. Henderson looked ready to bid higher, but his wife's sharp whisper in his ear seemed to change his mind. Mrs. Patterson appeared torn between admiration and horror. Margaret Henley had gone pale as milk. On the platform, Bo Rig was looking directly at her now, those grey eyes seeking her face among the crowd. When their gazes met, Cordelia felt something pass between them, not recognition, exactly, but acknowledgement, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and she was returning the favor. Any other bids? Jeremiah asked, though his tone suggested he expected none. The silence stretched long enough for Jubilee to grow bored and begin investigating the auctioneer's boot with her nose, causing him to hop sideways while maintaining his dignity. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. "Sold to the young lady in blue for $100. The crowd erupted in applause and conversation, but Cordelia barely heard any of it. She was still looking at Bo Rigg, who had begun descending from the platform with Jubilee ambling along behind him. The donkey's expression suggested she found the entire human race mildly amusing, but ultimately beneath her notice. "What have you done?" Margaret whispered, though she sounded more awed than accusatory. "I have absolutely no idea," Cordelia admitted, watching as Bo Rigg approached them through the crowd. People stepped aside to let him pass, some offering congratulations, others simply staring at the unusual spectacle of the town's wealthiest unmarried woman purchasing the services of a mysterious cowboy and his philosophical donkey. When he finally stood before her, Bo Rigg removed his hat and offered a slight bow that managed to be respectful without being servile. "Miss Vaughn," he said, his voice carrying a pleasant drawl that suggested origins somewhere south of the territorial border. "I believe we have business to discuss." "Indeed we do, Mr. Rigg," Cordelia replied, extending her gloved hand and trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when he shook it gently. "Indeed we do." Behind them, the auction continued with other lots, but Cordelia had stopped paying attention to anything except the tall man standing before her and the stubborn donkey who was apparently part of the arrangement. The labor auction gavel had changed more than just her plans for the week. It had started something that would reshape everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and what it meant to take a leap of faith. Bo Rigg's worn work gloves told stories in leather and stitch-mark stories of fence posts driven deep, cattle guided home, and honest work done under prairie skies. As he stood in the Vaughn family's kitchen the next morning, those gloves rested beside his coffee cup, like humble ambassadors from a simpler world. Cordelia had spent most of the previous evening explaining the situation to her father, a conversation that had gone about as well as expected. Charles Vaughn's face had cycled through disbelief, anger, and resignation before settling on grim acceptance. 1 week, he'd declared with the finality of a judge passing sentence. After that, this foolishness ends. Now, watching Bo examine the broken hinge on their back door, Cordelia wondered what she'd gotten herself into. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that actions spoke louder than words, his movements economical and purposeful. Within minutes, he'd identified the problem and begun gathering the tools he'd need from his small collection. "You don't have to fix that," Cordelia said, feeling oddly guilty about putting him to work so soon. "Mrs. Chen has been after Father to hire someone for months, but—" "Door won't hang right with a broken hinge," Bo replied, without looking up from his work. His voice carried the same calm certainty as his movements. "Seems like something worth fixing." Jubilee had claimed the kitchen's sunny corner near the stove, apparently having decided that comfort outweighed dignity. The donkey's presence had caused considerable discussion among the household staff, most of whom had never encountered livestock with quite so much personality. Mrs. Chen, their cook, had initially protested the arrangement before discovering that Jubilee possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect the exact moment when bread finished baking. "She's got better timing than most people I know," Mrs. Chen had admitted grudgingly, after Jubilee's third successful prediction of perfect donuts. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Sarah's arrival, followed closely by Thomas, who'd taken one look at their unusual guests and declared them the most interesting thing to happen since the circus came through last summer. Their youngest brother possessed the uncomplicated enthusiasm of youth, unburdened by social considerations that worried their father. "Good morning, Mr. Rigg," Sarah said brightly, having appointed herself as the family's official welcomer. "I hope you slept well in the barn." Bo straightened from his work, wiping his hands on a cloth before offering a slight nod. "Barn's fine, miss. Better than many places I've rested." Thomas bounded into the kitchen with the energy of a barely contained explosion. "Can I help? I've never seen anyone fix a door before." "Thomas," Cordelia began, but Bo held up a gentle hand. "Boy wants to learn, no harm in that," he said, handing Thomas a screwdriver. Sometimes the best education comes from watching someone who knows what they're doing. What followed was a masterclass in patience. Bo guided Thomas through each step of the repair process, explaining the why behind each action without talking down to his young student. When Thomas inevitably fumbled with the screwdriver, Bo simply repositioned his hands and encouraged him to try again. The trick, Bo explained as they aligned the new hinge, is understanding that everything wants to work properly. Your job isn't to force it, just to help it find its natural place. Cordelia found herself studying the man as much as the lesson. Bo Rigg possessed something she'd rarely encountered in her social circle: genuine authority that came from competence rather than position. He didn't need to announce his expertise because it showed in everything he did. "There," Bo said as the door swung smoothly on its repaired hinges. "Good as new, maybe better." Thomas beamed with pride as if he'd accomplished the repair single-handedly. "Can we fix something else?" "Thomas, you have lessons with Miss Morrison this morning," Cordelia reminded him, though she found herself curious about what other projects might benefit from Bo's attention. "Actually," Sarah interjected, "didn't you mention the fence around Mother's garden? The section that keeps falling down?" Cordelia's mother had planted an extensive flower garden behind the house, but the decorative fence that surrounded it had been fighting a losing battle against weather and time. 2 sections had collapsed entirely, while others leaned at angles that suggested imminent surrender. "I could take a look," Bo offered, already moving toward the window that overlooked the garden. His assessment was quick and thorough. Wood still good, mostly. Just needs proper reinforcement and maybe some new posts where the ground's shifted. "Father's been meaning to hire someone," Cordelia said, then caught herself. Bo was someone they'd hired, albeit through unconventional means. "I'd be happy to fix it," Bo replied. "Your mother had good taste in flowers. Shame to let her work go to waste for want of a proper fence." The casual way he spoke of her mother surprised Cordelia. Most people either avoided the subject entirely or offered awkward condolences that felt more obligatory than sincere. Bo's acknowledgement was simple and honest, free from the social calculations that usually accompanied such discussions. As the morning progressed, Cordelia found excuses to check on Bo's progress. She told herself it was responsible supervision. After all, they'd paid good money for his services. But honestly compelled her to admit that curiosity played a larger role than oversight. Bo worked with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to solitary labor, but he welcomed her observations without seeming to mind the interruption. Jubilee had appointed herself project supervisor, positioning herself where she could watch the proceedings while remaining close enough to the kitchen for strategic biscuit acquisition. "You have experience with gardens?" Cordelia asked, watching as Bo reset a fence post with mathematical precision. "Some," he replied, tamping earth around the new post. "Spent time on a farm in Kansas before." He paused, as if catching himself before revealing more than intended. "Before I took to cowboying." The pause intrigued Cordelia, but she didn't press. Everyone had chapters in their history they preferred to keep private, and Bo Rigg was entitled to his secrets. Still, she found herself wondering what had led him from Kansas farming to wherever his travels had taken him since. "The roses will appreciate the stability," she said instead, gesturing toward the climbing roses that had been struggling against their inadequate supports. "They're good stock," Bo agreed, running his gloved hand along one of the canes with surprising gentleness. "Someone knew what they were doing when they planted these. Give them proper support, they'll bloom for decades." Something in his tone suggested he was talking about more than just roses, but before Cordelia could pursue the thought, Jubilee released a series of brays that could only be described as imperious. "She's saying it's time for her mid-morning snack," Bo translated with perfect seriousness. "Jubilee keeps a strict schedule." "Does she really?" Cordelia asked, unsure whether he was joking. "Cross her at your own risk," Bo replied, and this time she caught the hint of humor in his grey eyes. "I've seen her hold grudges for weeks over delayed meals." As if to prove his point, Jubilee fixed Cordelia with a stare that somehow managed to convey both expectation and mild reproach for the conversation that was keeping everyone from their proper duties. "I'll see what Mrs. Chen can spare," Cordelia said, finding herself oddly charmed by the donkey's presumption. As she walked back toward the house, she realized that the morning had passed more pleasantly than any she could remember in months. There was something deeply satisfying about watching competent work being done with care and attention to detail. More surprising was how natural it felt to talk with Bo Rigg, as if they'd known each other far longer than the single day since their unconventional introduction. The work gloves told their stories, but Cordelia was beginning to suspect that the man who wore them had many more tales to share if she could earn the right to hear them. 3 days into Bo Rigg's employment, Cordelia discovered him in the nursery with Thomas and Sarah, patiently braiding tiny ribbons into the hair of Sarah's porcelain doll. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy, creating neat plaits that would have done credit to any lady's maid. Mr. Rigg learned from his sister, Thomas explained importantly, as if he'd been supervising the lesson. She taught him before she got married and moved to Oregon. Did she now? Cordelia settled into the rocking chair that had once been her mother's, fascinated by this glimpse into Bo's personal history. That must have been quite some time ago. 8 years, Bo replied, without looking up from his delicate work. Caroline was always better with details than I was, said a man who could gentle horses ought to be able to manage hair ribbons. Sarah watched the proceedings with rapt attention, occasionally offering suggestions about ribbon placement that Bo considered with the same seriousness he'd shown Thomas's questions about fence repair. The sight of this gentle giant treating a child's doll with such care did something unexpected to Cordelia's heart. "There," Bo announced, holding up the doll for inspection. "What do you think?" "She's beautiful," Sarah breathed, accepting the doll with reverence. "Look, Cordelia, isn't she perfect?" The doll did indeed look charming, her blonde ringlets now adorned with pale blue ribbons that complemented her painted features. But Cordelia found herself more interested in Bo's satisfied expression as he observed Sarah's delight. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Rigg," Cordelia said. "Man learns all sorts of things when he's got time and reason," Bo replied, beginning to gather the remaining ribbons. "No shame in useful skills, regardless of where you pick them up." This practical wisdom had become a hallmark of Bo's approach to life at the Vaughan household. Over the past 3 days, he'd repaired not just the garden fence and kitchen door, but also a loose board on the front porch, a squeaky wheel on Mrs. Chen's market cart, and a window shutter that had been hanging crooked for months. Each task was completed with the same methodical competence, as if Bo viewed problems as puzzles to be solved, rather than burdens to be endured. "Will you teach me to braid?" Thomas asked eagerly. "I could help Sarah with her dolls." "I reckon I could show you the basics," Bo agreed, "though your sister might be a better teacher for the fancy work." "Could you really?" Sarah turned to Cordelia with shining eyes. "It would be such fun to learn together." Cordelia found herself agreeing before she'd fully considered the implications. The idea of spending an evening learning domestic skills from their temporarily employed cowboy struck her as both absurd and oddly appealing. When had she last tried something completely new? That evening found them gathered in the front parlor, where Bo demonstrated the fundamental principles of braiding using lengths of rope he'd brought from the barn. His explanation was clear and patient, breaking down the seemingly complex pattern into manageable steps. "The key," he said, guiding Thomas's small fingers through the motions, "is keeping even tension. Too tight and you can't work with it. Too loose and it falls apart." "Like people," Sarah observed unexpectedly. "Too much pressure and they break. Too little and they drift away." Bo's hands stilled for a moment, and he looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. "That's wise thinking, miss. Your sister's got a philosopher's mind." "Sarah reads entirely too much poetry," Cordelia said, though her tone was fond rather than critical. "It gives her romantic notions about everything." "Nothing wrong with seeing beauty in the world," Bo replied. "Takes courage to stay hopeful when you've seen enough to know better." Something in his voice suggested personal experience with that particular challenge, but before Cordelia could explore the comment, their father's voice echoed from the doorway. "What exactly is happening here?" Charles Vaughan stood in the parlor entrance, his expression cycling through confusion, disapproval, and barely contained frustration. He'd been working late in his study, reviewing bank documents, and clearly hadn't expected to find his hired hand conducting family lessons in domestic crafts. "Mr. Rigg was teaching us to braid," Thomas announced cheerfully, apparently oblivious to his father's mood. "Look what I made." He held up his practice rope, which showed definite improvement from his initial attempts. Charles Vaughan examined the work with the sort of attention usually reserved for loan applications. "I see," he said finally. "And this is how you choose to spend your evening, learning rope work from—" He gestured vaguely at Beau, who had risen respectfully upon the older man's entrance. "From someone with useful skills," Cordelia finished smoothly. "I thought it might be educational for Thomas and Sarah." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Beau stood quietly, his expression neutral, but Cordelia could sense his discomfort with being the cause of family discord. She felt a sudden urge to defend him, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "Mr. Rigg has been extremely helpful," she continued. "The garden fence is completely repaired, and he's fixed several things that have needed attention for months." "I'm sure he has," her father replied, his tone suggesting that Beau's competence was beside the point. "However, I trust we can maintain appropriate boundaries between employer and employee." The words stung, and Cordelia saw Beau's jaw tighten slightly. There was nothing inappropriate about the evening's activities, but her father's implication was clear. Hired help belonged in their place, which wasn't the family parlor. "Of course, father," Cordelia said, though her agreeable tone masked growing irritation. "Perhaps we should continue our lesson in the kitchen tomorrow." "Perhaps," Charles agreed, apparently satisfied that he'd made his point. "Mr. Rigg, I trust you have early duties tomorrow?" "Yes, sir," Beau replied evenly. "Planning to check the roof over the carriage house. Storm last month might have loosened some shingles." "Excellent. Sarah, Thomas, time for bed. Cordelia, might I have a word?" As her siblings gathered their things and bid Beau good night, Cordelia prepared herself for the conversation she'd been dreading since the labor auction. Her father waited until they were alone before settling into his preferred chair, with the air of a man preparing to deliver an important lecture. "Cordelia, I've been patient with this experiment because you paid for it with your own money, but I won't have you forgetting your position in this household or this community." "I haven't forgotten anything, father." "Haven't you? Because from where I stand, it appears you're developing an inappropriate interest in our temporary employee." His voice carried the reasonable tone he used with difficult bank customers. "The man is clearly competent, but that doesn't make him suitable company for young ladies of breeding. He's teaching my brother useful skills and treating my sister with kindness and respect. What exactly is inappropriate about that?" "The impropriety lies in the familiarity, Cordelia. Servant Sand, make no mistake, that's what he is require, proper management. They shouldn't be invited into family activities or treated as equals." Cordelia felt her temper rising, but years of practice helped her maintain composure. "Beau Rigg has shown nothing but proper behavior and genuine care for this family's welfare. If that makes him unsuitable company, perhaps we should examine what that says about the people we do consider appropriate." Her father's expression darkened. "I won't have you speaking to me in that tone, young lady, and I certainly won't have you defending hired help over your own family." "I'm not defending anyone over anyone else. I'm simply pointing out that competence and character aren't determined by social position." "Enough." Charles Vaughan's voice carried the finality that had ended 1,000 banking negotiations. "The man finishes his week and leaves. After that, we'll have no more experiments with unconventional employees." "Of course, father," Cordelia replied, though privately she was beginning to think that 1 week might not be nearly enough time to understand the man who braided hair ribbons with the same careful attention he brought to fixing broken fences. The hand-carved wooden horse appeared on Cordelia's windowsill Thursday morning, no bigger than her palm but perfect in every detail. She discovered it while arranging fresh flowers from the garden roses that now bloomed properly thanks to Beau's repaired fence. The little horse stood alert and proud, its mane flowing as if caught by prairie wind, its hooves positioned as though ready to gallop toward distant horizons. "Thomas," she called to her brother who was passing in the hallway, "did you leave this in my room?" "Leave what?" Thomas peered at the carved figure with genuine curiosity. "That's beautiful. Where did it come from?" Before Cordelia could speculate further, Sarah appeared in the doorway, drawn by their conversation. Her gasp of delight confirmed that she wasn't responsible for the gift either. "It's exquisite," Sarah breathed, examining the horse with the reverence usually reserved for precious jewelry. "Look at the detail in the eyes. You can almost see intelligence there." Cordelia turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the smoothness of the wood and the precision of each tiny feature. Whoever had created this piece possessed both artistic skill and infinite patience. The horse seemed to pulse with captured life, as if it might spring from her palm and thunder across the room. "Mr. Rigg carved it," Thomas announced with the confidence of youth. "How could you possibly know that?" Cordelia asked. "Because I saw him working on it yesterday evening when I went to say goodnight to Jubilee. He was sitting outside the barn, whittling by lamplight." Thomas's matter-of-fact delivery made his sisters exchange glances. "I asked what he was making, but he said it was a surprise." The idea that Beau had spent his evening hours creating something beautiful, rather than simply resting after his labors, touched Cordelia unexpectedly. She'd assumed he collapsed into sleep each night, exhausted from the physical demands of his work around their property. Instead, he'd been crafting this tiny masterpiece with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "Did he say who it was for?" Sarah asked with barely contained excitement. "He said it was for someone who appreciated things that ran free," Thomas replied. "I figured he meant you, Cordelia, since you're always talking about wanting to travel and see the world." The accuracy of Thomas's interpretation surprised her. She did indeed dream of traveling, of seeing mountains and oceans and cities that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of Sundown Bluff. But she'd never mentioned those longings to Beau, which meant he'd somehow intuited her restless spirit from their limited interactions. "I should thank him," Cordelia said, though she felt oddly nervous about acknowledging the gift. Accepting it seemed to cross some invisible line between employer and employee, a line her father had already warned her about. She found Beau behind the carriage house, true to his word about checking the roof. He'd positioned a ladder against the building and was systematically examining each shingle, replacing those that showed weather damage with others from a neat stack he'd prepared. "Mr. Rigg," she called up to him, "might I have a word?" He descended with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with heights, landing lightly despite his size. His shirt was damp with honest sweat, and sawdust clung to his dark hair. "Something you need, Miss Vaughan." "I wanted to thank you." She held up the wooden horse, watching as his expression grew carefully neutral. "It's beautiful work." "Glad you like it," he replied, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. "Had some extra time last evening. Thomas said you've been carving after your work is finished. That seems above and beyond your responsibilities here." Beau shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey both modesty and slight embarrassment. "Man needs something to do with his hands when his mind won't settle. Carving helps me think." "What do you think about?" The question slipped out before Cordelia could stop it, more personal than she'd intended. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Beau's grey eyes studied her face, as if trying to determine how much truth she could handle. "Lots of things," he said finally. "Where I've been, where I'm headed, whether the choices I've made were right or just necessary." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "Lately, I've been thinking about whether a man can change what he is, or if he's stuck with what life makes him." The vulnerability in his admission caught Cordelia off guard. Here was a glimpse beneath Beau Rigg's carefully maintained surface, a hint at the complexity she'd sensed from their first meeting. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're all capable of becoming more than what we were. The question is whether we have the courage to try. And if the trying means disappointing people who matter, then perhaps those people matter less than we thought." The words hung between them, laden with implications that extended far beyond theoretical philosophy. Cordelia realized she was no longer just talking about change in general terms. She was talking about Bo specifically, and by extension, about her own willingness to disappoint her father's expectations. "Your family's been kind to me," Bo said, though his tone suggested the conversation had grown more serious than either of them had intended. "Don't want to cause problems where none existed before." "The problems existed before you arrived, Mr. Rigg. They were just easier to ignore." The admission surprised her with its honesty. It was true her dissatisfaction with her prescribed role, her frustration with social expectations, her longing for something more authentic than the relationships her position attracted. All of these tensions had been building long before the labor auction. Bo's presence hadn't created them, it had simply made them impossible to overlook. "Still," Bo said, "man in my position needs to be careful about overstepping boundaries." "What position is that exactly?" The question clearly caught him off guard. His careful expression shifted, revealing something that might have been surprise or wariness. "Hired help," he said after a moment. "Temporary employee. Someone passing through who shouldn't get ideas above his station." "And what if someone else, someone not in your position, thought those boundaries were worth questioning?" The space between them seemed to compress, charged with unspoken possibilities. Cordelia could see Bo weighing her words, trying to determine if she meant what he thought she meant. "That would depend," he said carefully, "on whether that someone understood the costs of questioning them. Perhaps that someone is tired of letting costs determine all her choices." They stood there in the afternoon sunlight, the carved horse warm in Cordelia's palm. While around them, the world continued its normal routines. Mrs. Chen called to the chickens in the yard. Jubilee brayed companionably from her position near the vegetable garden. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. But none of those familiar sounds could diminish the sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. Cordelia felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, recognizing that her next words or actions would determine whether she stepped back to safety or leaped toward whatever lay beyond. "I should let you return to your work," she said finally, though every instinct urged her to stay and explore this moment further. "Yes, ma'am," Bo agreed, though he made no immediate move toward the ladder. "Mr. Rigg," she called as she turned to leave. "Yes?" "The horse, it's perfect. Thank you." His smile was brief but genuine, transforming his weathered features with unexpected warmth. "You're welcome, Miss Vaughan. Figured something that beautiful deserved to run free." As Cordelia walked back toward the house, the wooden horse seemed to pulse with possibilities in her palm, as if it carried not just Bo's artistic skill, but his dreams of freedom as well. The faded military medal lay hidden beneath Bo's spare shirt, wrapped in oiled cloth that spoke of careful preservation. Cordelia discovered it entirely by accident Friday afternoon when she brought fresh linens to the barn, intending to replace the bedding she'd provided for his week's stay. The bundle fell from the shelf as she arranged the clean sheets, spilling its contents across the hay-covered floor. She knelt to gather the scattered items, a few personal effects, a small Bible, and the medal that gleamed dully in the afternoon light, filtering through the barn's open doors. The bronze disc was attached to a ribbon that had once been bright blue but now showed the wear of years and careful handling. The inscription was partially worn but still legible, "For gallant service in defense of the Union." Cordelia sat back on her heels, the medal heavy in her palm. A Civil War veteran. That would make Bo considerably older than she'd assumed, though his weathered face could belong to a man of 30 or 50 with equal probability. More importantly, it suggested a history far more complex than she'd imagined. "Find what you were looking for?" Bo's voice from the barn entrance made her start guiltily. He stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene, her kneeling among his scattered possessions, the medal obvious in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, scrambling to her feet. "I was bringing fresh linens, and your things fell. I wasn't trying to pry." "Didn't figure you were." Bo approached slowly, as if giving her time to flee if she chose. Not many people go looking through other folks' private things on purpose. He held out his hand, and Cordelia placed the medal in his palm, noting how his fingers closed around it, with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "The war," she said, not quite a question. "The war," he confirmed, settling onto a hay bale and gesturing for her to join him. "Long time ago now. Sometimes feels like yesterday." Cordelia perched on the edge of another bale, maintaining proper distance while satisfying her curiosity. "You were young. 17 when I enlisted, 19 when it ended, old enough to know better, too young to care." Bo turned the medal over in his hands, his expression distant. "Thought I was going to save the world. Figured I'd come home a hero, and everything would be different. And instead I learned that wars don't really end, they just stop shooting. The things you see, the things you do, they follow you around like shadows." He looked up at her then, his grey eyes holding depths she was only beginning to understand. "Some men come home and pick up where they left off. Others find they don't fit in the same spaces anymore." The honesty in his admission made Cordelia's chest tighten. She'd known men who'd served her father's generation was full of veterans, but none had ever spoken about their experiences with such raw candor. Most preferred to focus on the glory and purpose, glossing over whatever darkness they'd encountered. "Is that why you became a cowboy? Because you didn't fit?" Bo smiled, but there was little humor in it. "Cowboys are mostly men who don't fit somewhere else. We tell ourselves we're free, riding the open range, but truth is, we're just running from things we can't face standing still." "And what are you running from?" The question hung between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared before. Cordelia half expected Bo to deflect or change the subject, but instead he seemed to consider her words carefully. "Guilt, mostly," he said finally. "Things I did that needed doing but weren't right. Men I killed who probably had families waiting for them. Choices I made that saved some lives and cost others." He paused, then added with devastating honesty, "The fear that maybe I'm not the man I want to be, just the man the war made me." Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't have said whether they were for the young soldier Bo had been or the man he'd become. "The war ended more than a decade ago. Surely you've found some peace since then." "Some," he agreed. "Working with my hands helps. Animals don't judge you for what you've done, they just care how you treat them today. And sometimes," he looked at her directly, "sometimes you meet people who see something worth saving." The words hit Cordelia like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were so full of hope. Here was a man who'd carried unimaginable burdens, who'd been shaped by violence and loss, yet who still believed in the possibility of redemption. "Mr. Rigbo," she began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate what she was feeling. "I know what you're thinking," he said gently, "and you're probably right to think it. A man with my history has no business developing feelings for a woman like you." "A woman like me?" "Good family, proper education, bright future ahead of her. You deserve better than someone who's spent the last 15 years trying to outrun his ghosts." Cordelia felt a flash of anger at his assumption. "Don't you think I should be the judge of what I deserve? Not when my presence could ruin your reputation and disappoint your family." Bo's voice carried the weight of a man who'd made this argument with himself many times. "Your father already thinks I'm overstepping. He's not wrong. My father thinks anyone who wasn't born into banking and real estate is beneath our notice. That doesn't make him right about character or worth." "Maybe not, but it makes him right about consequences. Society's got rules for a reason, even when those rules seem unfair. A woman in your position can't afford to ignore them without paying a price." The frustration in Cordelia's chest was building towards something dangerous. Here was Bo, essentially telling her that her feelings, whatever they were, didn't matter because other people might disapprove. It was the same argument she'd been hearing her entire life, dressed up in concern for her welfare. "So I should marry someone my father approves of? Someone with the right background and proper prospects? Someone who sees me as a business arrangement rather than a person worth knowing?" "You should marry someone who can give you the life you're accustomed to," Bo replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone who won't cost you your family's respect or your place in society." And what if I don't want the life I'm accustomed to? What if I want something real instead of something appropriate? The question seemed to surprise him. Bo studied her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time, taking in not just her words but the passion behind them. Then you'd be taking an awful big risk, he said finally. Maybe I'm tired of playing it safe. And maybe I'm tired of running. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. But wanting something and being able to have it aren't the same thing. They could be, Cordelia said softly, if we had the courage to try. The afternoon light slanted through the barn doors, painting everything in golden hues that seemed to promise possibility. Somewhere in the distance, Jubilee brayed contentedly, and the normal sounds of the household continued their familiar patterns. But inside the barn, time seemed suspended, holding them in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. "Your week is almost over," Bo said, though the words sounded like they cost him something to speak. "Yes," Cordelia agreed, "it is." Neither of them mentioned what would happen when Sunday came, but the approaching deadline hung between them like a sword, sharp and unavoidable. Whatever they decided, whatever they dared would have to happen soon. The wanted poster arrived Saturday morning with the weekly mail, carried by a postal rider who seemed unusually eager to share his burden with anyone willing to listen. Cordelia first heard about it from Mrs. Chen, who'd gotten the news from her nephew, who'd heard it from the blacksmith, who'd been present when the poster was nailed to the courthouse wall. "Says he's dangerous," Mrs. Chen reported with the breathless excitement that accompanied truly spectacular gossip. "Armed and dangerous, wanted for robbery and worse." Cordelia's blood went cold. "Who's wanted?" "That cowboy fellow you hired, Bo Rigg, though the poster says his real name is something different. Says he rode with the Comancheros down in Texas, robbing trains and killing lawmen." Mrs. Chen's voice dropped to a scandalized whisper. "They're offering $500 for information leading to his capture." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Cordelia gripped the kitchen table for support, her mind reeling with the implications. Bo Rigg, the man who'd braided ribbons into Sarah's doll hair, who'd patiently taught Thomas to fix broken things, who'd carved a wooden horse with gentle hands, was a wanted criminal. "Where is the poster now?" she managed to ask. "Courthouse Square. Half the town's gathered to look at it. Sheriff Morrison's organizing a search party." Mrs. Chen's eyes gleamed with the sort of excitement that came from being close to dramatic events. "Imagine having an outlaw right here under our noses." Cordelia's mind raced. If half the town was looking at the poster, it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection between the wanted man and their temporary employee. Bo's distinctive height and build would make him impossible to mistake once people started looking. "Mrs. Chen, please don't mention this to Father or the children just yet. I need to verify the details before causing unnecessary alarm." "Of course, miss. Though I'd be careful if I were you. Man like that, no telling what he might do if he feels cornered." Cordelia fought the urge to defend Bo, recognizing that such a defense would only raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Instead, she excused herself and hurried toward the barn, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and determination. She found Bo exactly where she'd expected, checking on Jubilee, who was enjoying her morning meal with characteristic enthusiasm. He looked up as Cordelia approached, and something in her expression must have warned him because his entire demeanor shifted, becoming watchful and wary. "What's happened?" he asked quietly. "There's a wanted poster at the courthouse, with your name on it." The words came out flat and stark, but Cordelia couldn't manage anything gentler. Bo's face went carefully blank, the same neutral expression she'd seen him wear around her father. But his hand stilled on Jubilee's neck, and she caught the slight intake of breath that suggested the news wasn't entirely unexpected. "I see," he said finally. "Is it true?" The question tore from her throat before she could stop it. Did you really? Rob trains, kill lawmen?" Bo's voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his grey eyes. "Some of it's true, not all of it, but enough." The admission hit her like a physical blow. Part of her had been hoping for a complete denial, for evidence that the poster was a case of mistaken identity or malicious lies. Instead, Bo was confirming her worst fears with the same honest directness he'd shown in everything else. "How much of it?" she whispered. Bo leaned against Jubilee's stall, suddenly looking every one of his years and more. "After the war, I couldn't settle. Tried farming, tried regular work, but the nightmares and the anger they followed me everywhere. Met up with some other veterans who felt the same way. We told ourselves we were just trying to survive, but survival turned into taking what we needed from people who had more than enough. The trains? 3 of them, over 2 years. We never hurt passengers, never took personal belongings. Just money from railroad companies that were getting rich off other people's work." His voice carried no pride, only the flat recitation of facts. "Told ourselves we were some kind of Robin Hood outfit, stealing from the rich. And the lawmen?" This question hung heavier between them. Bo's silence stretched long enough that Cordelia began to fear the worst possible answer. "2 men died," he said finally. "Neither by my hand directly, but I was there. I was part of it. When you ride with a gang, you share responsibility for what the gang does." Cordelia felt tears threatening but fought them back. This was no time for emotional breakdown. Bo needed her to think clearly, to understand the full scope of what they were facing. "How long ago?" 5 years since the last job. We split up after disagreement about methods. Some of the boys wanted to branch out into banks, maybe start targeting smaller towns. I couldn't stomach that. Bo's hands resumed their gentle stroking of Jubilee's neck, as if the contact provided comfort for both of them. "Been moving around ever since, doing honest work, trying to make up for what I'd done. And now they've found you. Looks that way. Question is, how long before someone in town makes the connection?" Bo straightened, his expression becoming grimly practical. "I should pack my things and move on before that happens. Don't want to bring trouble down on your family." "Wait." The word came out more sharply than Cordelia intended. "Just wait. Give me a moment to think." But thinking proved difficult when her emotions were in chaos. The man she'd been falling in love with, and she could admit that to herself now, when it might be too late, was a former outlaw with blood on his hands. Everything she thought she knew about Bo Rigg had been built on incomplete information. Yet even as that realization sank in, another truth asserted itself with equal force. The Bo Rigg she'd come to know over the past week was real. His gentleness with her siblings, his careful craftsmanship, his obvious remorse for past actions, none of that was false. The man who'd carved the wooden horse and patiently taught Thomas to braid rope was the same person who'd once ridden with outlaws. "The poster," she said suddenly. "What name does it use?" "Probably Robert Riggs. That was my name during the outlaw years, close enough to my real name that I'd answer to it, different enough to provide some protection. But you've been using Bo Rigg here." "It's my real name, Robert Beauregard Rigg, named after my grandfather. Bo's what my family always called me." The distinction mattered, though Cordelia wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because it suggested that Bo had chosen to be honest with them, even if that honesty was incomplete. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Depends on how good people's memories are and how hard they look. Could be hours, could be days, but not long." Bo began moving toward his few possessions, clearly preparing to leave. "Best thing for everyone is if I disappear before anyone makes the connection." "And go where? Keep running for the rest of your life?" "If that's what it takes to keep you safe." The simple declaration undid something in Cordelia's chest. Here was a man willing to sacrifice his own chance at happiness to protect her reputation, her family's standing, her future prospects. The irony was devastating. Just when she'd found someone whose character she genuinely respected, circumstances were forcing them apart. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Like what? You going to hide an outlaw in your barn? Lie to the sheriff when he comes asking questions?" Bo's tone was gentle, but implacable. "This isn't some adventure story, Cordelia. This is real life, with real consequences." "I know it's real," she snapped, frustration overriding caution. "I also know that you're not the same man who rode with those outlaws. 5 years of honest work should count for something." "Should" isn't the same as does. Law doesn't care about redemption, it cares about justice. and maybe that's how it should be. Don't you dare give up, Cordelia said fiercely. Don't you dare decide that your past mistakes define everything you could be. Bo looked at her then with an expression of such tender regret that it nearly broke her heart. Sweet girl, you don't understand what you're asking. Fighting this means dragging you and your family into something that could destroy everything your father's built. I won't do that to people who've shown me nothing but kindness. Then let us decide what we're willing to risk. It's not your choice to make, isn't it? You said yesterday that maybe you were tired of running. Well, I'm tired of other people deciding what risks I can and can't take with my own life. Before Bo could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the direction of the main road. Multiple riders, moving fast, the sort of sound that meant official business rather than social calls. Too late, Bo said grimly, moving to the barn window. Sheriff's coming, and he's got company. Cordelia joined him at the window, watching as 5 men on horseback approached the house. Sheriff Morrison led the group, his badge glinting in the morning sun, while 4 deputized townsmen flanked him with the grim determination of men pursuing dangerous prey. Last chance, Bo said quietly. You can still claim you had no idea who I really was. Tell them I gave you a false name and you believed it. Cordelia looked at him, really look-taking in the weathered face, the steady grey eyes, the hands that had shown such gentleness despite whatever violence they'd once committed. In that moment, she realized that the choice before her wasn't really about Bo at all. It was about what kind of person she wanted to be, what kind of life she wanted to live. No, she said firmly, we face this together. The legal documents her father clutched in his trembling hands would ensure Bo's immediate arrest and removal from Sundown Bluff if Cordelia allowed them to be served. Charles Vaughan had retreated to his study after the sheriff's initial visit, emerging an hour later with papers that spoke of his connections, his influence, and his absolute determination to remove what he saw as a threat to his family's reputation. I've spoken with Judge Harrison, he announced to Cordelia as she stood in the hallway outside his study. These documents authorize the sheriff to hold Mr. Rigger, whoever he really is, until the territorial marshals can collect him. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies had withdrawn to the front porch after their initial confrontation with Bo, apparently content to wait for official authorization before making an arrest. The wanted poster had provided enough evidence for suspicion, but Morrison was a careful man who preferred his legal procedures to be unassailable. You're condemning a man who's done nothing but honest work while he's been here, Cordelia said, fighting to keep her voice level despite the turmoil in her chest. I'm protecting this family from a criminal who lied his way into our home. Her father's face was flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. Do you have any idea what this could do to our standing in the community, to your prospects for marriage? I don't care about my prospects for marriage. Well, I do, and I care about your brother and sister's futures as well. The Vaughan name means something in this territory, Cordelia. I won't have it tainted by association with outlaws and killers. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be dangerous. Bo had admitted to riding with men who'd killed lawmen, even if he hadn't pulled the triggers himself. In the eyes of the law and society, that distinction might not matter. But in Cordelia's eyes, it mattered enormously. He's not the same man who made those choices, she said desperately. 5 years of honest work, Father. 5 years of trying to make amends for past mistakes. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts for nothing if he's hanged for past crimes. Charles Vaughan's voice softened slightly, as if he recognized the pain he was causing. Cordelia, I know you've developed feelings for this man. It's understandable. He's charismatic. He's treated our family well, and you've always been drawn to lost causes. But this isn't some injured bird you can nurse back to health. This is a dangerous criminal who's deceived us all. He never deceived us. He gave us his real name. He's done exactly the work he promised, and he's shown nothing but respect and kindness to everyone in this household. Cordelia's voice rose, despite her efforts to remain calm. If anyone's been deceived, It's Bo deceived into thinking he could find acceptance and redemption in a place that values reputation more than character. Her father's expression hardened. Enough. I've made my decision, and I won't be swayed by romantic nonsense. The man leaves today, willingly or otherwise. And if I refuse to let you serve those papers, then you'll be choosing an outlaw over your own family. Is that really what you want? The question hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Cordelia realized that this moment represented more than just Bo's fate, was about her own future, her willingness to stand up for what she believed, regardless of consequences. Maybe I'm choosing my own conscience over other people's expectations, she replied. Maybe I'm tired of letting fear determine every decision I make. Charles Vaughan stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. You're serious about this? You're actually willing to destroy everything we've built for a man you've known less than a week? I'm willing to fight for someone who deserves a second chance. Yes. Then you're a fool. The words came out harsh and final, and I won't enable your foolishness by allowing you to harbor a criminal under our roof. He moved toward the front door, documents in hand, but Cordelia stepped into his path. Father, wait. Please, give me 1 hour to talk to him, 1 hour to convince him to leave voluntarily. Surely that's better than having him arrested on our property with half the town watching. Charles Vaughan paused, clearly torn between his desire for immediate resolution and his recognition that a public arrest would create exactly the sort of spectacle he was trying to avoid. 1 hour, he said finally. After that, I hand these papers to Sheriff Morrison whether Mr. Rigg is still here or not. Cordelia nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and desperation. 1 hour to find a solution that seemed impossible, 1 hour to convince a man with a target on his back that running wasn't his only option. She found Bo in the barn, methodically packing his few possessions, while Jubilee watched with an expression of donkey disapproval. He looked up as she entered, and she could see from his face that he'd expected this conversation. How long do I have? He asked without preamble. 1 hour before Father hands arrest papers to Sheriff Morrison. Then I should leave now. Jubilee's ready to travel, and I can cover ground faster if I start immediately. Bo, please, listen to me. Cordelia moved closer, noting how he'd positioned himself between her and his packed gear, as if he were already preparing to put distance between them. There has to be another way. Like what? You've got a sheriff on your porch and a wanted poster with my description nailed to the courthouse. What exactly do you think we can do about that? I don't know yet, but running solves nothing. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, never able to settle anywhere, never able to build anything lasting. She gestured toward Jubilee, who was regarding them both with intelligent eyes. Is that really what you want? For yourself or for her? What I want doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you safe. I'm safe. Father's angry, but he's not going to disown me over this. The worst that happens is some social embarrassment and a few cancelled invitations to parties. I don't want to attend anyway. Bo shook his head grimly. You're not thinking clearly. Once word spreads that you harbored an outlaw, willingly harbored him after you knew what he was, you'll be lucky if respectable society ever accepts you again. Your father's business could suffer. Your siblings' futures could be affected. And you're not thinking clearly either, Cordelia shot back. You're so convinced that you don't deserve a second chance that you're not even willing to fight for one. Fighting means putting other people at risk. I've done enough of that in my life. This isn't about putting people at risk, it's about standing up for what's right. You've spent 5 years trying to make amends for past mistakes. That should count for something. Should and does are different things. Then make them the same thing. Stay and face this. Let people see the man you've become instead of only the man you used to be. Bo stopped packing and looked at her directly, his grey eyes holding a mixture of hope and despair that broke her heart. And if they don't care about the man I've become, if all they see is the outlaw on the wanted poster, then at least you'll know you tried. At least you'll know that some people, her voice caught slightly, some people saw your worth and were willing to fight for it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of impossible choices and uncertain outcomes. Finally, Bo spoke, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. If I stay, if I fight this, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about you too, and the choices you'll have to live with. Once you take a stand, there's no going back to the way things were. I know that. Do you? Really? Because right now you're angry, and your heart's making decisions your head might regret later. When the excitement dies down and you're facing the real consequences, social isolation, limited marriage prospects, your father's disappointment, you might feel differently. Cordelia met his gaze steadily. I might. But I might also spend the rest of my life regretting that I let fear keep me from fighting for something real. And if fighting means losing everything, then at least I'll have fought for something worth losing everything for. The words seemed to surprise them both with their finality. Cordelia realized she'd crossed some internal threshold, moving from uncertainty to conviction, with a decisiveness that felt both terrifying and liberating. 1 hour, Bo said finally. 1 hour, she agreed. What do you want me to do? Cordelia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around her shoulders like a cloak. I want you to come with me, to face Sheriff Morrison. I want you to tell your story, all of it, and let people decide for themselves what kind of man you are now. And if they decide I'm still the outlaw from the poster, then we'll face that together too. Bo studied her face for a long moment, searching for something doubt, perhaps, or the kind of uncertainty that might give him permission to protect her by leaving. But whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. All right, he said, shouldering his pack with movements that suggested the decision wasn't as easy as his words made it sound. Let's go see what kind of justice a man can find in Sundown Bluff. As they walked toward the house together, Jubilee trailing behind with the air of someone who'd expected this outcome all along, Cordelia felt the future spreading before them like an uncharted territory. She had no idea what they would find there, but for the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path rather than following one laid out by others. The documents in her father's hands would soon determine whether that path led to redemption or ruin. But either way, she wouldn't be walking it alone. The town bell began its urgent clanging just as Cordelia and Bo reached the front porch, its bronze voice carrying across Sundown Bluff with the authority of crisis or celebration. Sheriff Morrison looked up from his conversation with the deputies, his weathered face creasing with concern. That's the assembly call, one of the deputies said unnecessarily. Everyone in town recognized the pattern 3 long peals followed by rapid chiming that summoned the community for important announcements or emergency gatherings. Within minutes, people began emerging from shops and houses, drawn by the bell's insistent voice toward the courthouse square. Cordelia watched the familiar faces of her neighbors, the banker's wife, the preacher's family, merchants closing their stores to investigate the commotion. Word traveled fast in a small town, and she suspected most of them already knew about the wanted poster and the manhunt it had triggered. Looks like we'll have an audience, Bo observed quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. Charles Vaughan appeared in the doorway behind them, the legal document still clutched in his hand. His face was pale but determined, a man who'd made his decision and intended to see it through, regardless of consequences. Sheriff Morrison, he called out, I believe we have business to conclude. Actually, Mr. Vaughan, I think that business might need to wait. Morrison gestured toward the courthouse square, where a substantial crowd was gathering. Judge Harrison's called an emergency session, says he wants to address the wanted poster situation publicly. What kind of emergency session? Cordelia asked, though her heart was already racing with possibility. The kind where a man gets to tell his side of things before being carted off to jail. Morrison replied with surprising fairness. Judge Harrison believes in due process, even for outlaws, especially when said outlaws have been working peacefully in our community. Charles Vaughan's face darkened. This is highly irregular. The poster clearly identifies him as a wanted criminal. The poster identifies someone named Robert Riggs, Morrison corrected. And while Mr. Rigg here bears a strong resemblance to that description, we've got procedures to follow. Judge Harrison wants to hear from both the accused and the accuser before making any determinations. "Who's the accuser?" Bo asked, speaking for the first time since joining the group on the porch. "Railroad detective named Sullivan. Came in on the morning train. Says he's been tracking you for months." Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. "Also says he's got new evidence about those train robberies that might interest a judge." The crowd in the courthouse square had swelled to include what looked like half the town's population. Cordelia could see Margaret Henley standing with her mother, Tom Henderson arguing with his ranch hands about something, and Mrs. Patterson clutching her shawl as if expecting shocking revelations. "I suppose we should join them," Cordelia said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded, despite the chaos in her chest. "Miss Vaughan," Sheriff Morrison said with a politeness that didn't quite hide his concern, "you don't need to involve yourself in this proceeding. Might be better if you stayed out of what's likely to be an unpleasant business. Mr. Rigg has been employed by our family. I have every right to be present when his character is being questioned." "Cordelia," her father began warningly. "Father, I'm going to the courthouse. The question is whether I go as part of our family or in spite of it." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, sharp and uncompromising. Charles Vaughan looked from his daughter to Bo, clearly weighing his options and finding them all unpalatable. "Very well," he said finally, "but understand that your presence doesn't constitute family endorsement of this man's character. And understand that my presence absolutely constitutes my personal endorsement of his character," Cordelia replied evenly. As they walked toward the courthouse square, Cordelia noticed how the crowd parted before them, not with hostility exactly, but with the sort of fascinated attention usually reserved for public spectacles. She caught fragments of whispered conversations, "That's him, the outlaw," and "Can't believe he was right here under our noses," and "Miss Vaughan's got some nerve," showing her face. The courthouse steps had been converted into an impromptu forum, with Judge Harrison presiding from behind a makeshift bench. A tall, thin man in a railroad detective's badge stood to one side, holding a leather satchel that presumably contained his evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Harrison called out as the crowd settled into expectant silence, "we're here to address the matter of Mr. Bo Rigg and the accusations that have been made against him. This isn't a formal trial, but it is a proceeding under territorial law, and I expect everyone to conduct themselves accordingly." He gestured toward Bo, who stepped forward with the quiet dignity that had characterized all his actions since arriving in Sundown Bluff. "Mr. Rigg, you've been accused of being the outlaw Robert Riggs, wanted for train robbery and conspiracy. How do you answer these accusations?" Bo removed his hat, holding it respectfully as he addressed both the judge and the crowd. "Your Honor, I am Robert Beauregard Rigg. I did ride with the men described in that wanted poster. I participated in the crimes they're accused of, though not in the way the poster suggests." A murmur ran through the crowd. Surprise, vindication, disappointment. The town bell's urgent bronze voice summoned half of Sundown Bluff to witness what would become the most talked-about public hearing in the territory's history. Cordelia stood beside Bo on the courthouse steps, acutely aware of how the assembled crowd studied their every movement, searching for signs of guilt, defiance, or the kind of romantic scandal that would fuel gossip for months. Judge Harrison had arranged the proceeding with theatrical precision. A makeshift bench sat prominently on the courthouse steps, flanked by chairs for witnesses and officials. The wanted poster, that damning piece of paper that had started everything, was displayed on an easel where everyone could see Bo's likeness alongside the accusations that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. Sheriff Morrison stood to one side with his deputies, their presence a reminder that this gathering could end with Bo in shackles regardless of what testimony emerged. Charles Vaughan occupied a position near the front of the crowd, the legal document still clutched in his hand like a weapon he wasn't sure he wanted to use. "Ladies and gentlemen of Sundown Bluff," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly across the expectant crowd, "we're gathered here to address serious accusations against Mr. Bo Rigg, who has been working peacefully in our community. While this isn't a formal trial, it is a legal proceeding under territorial authority. The crowd stirred with anticipation. Cordelia could see familiar faces throughout the assembly merchants who'd benefited from Beau's carpentry work, children he'd helped with various projects, women whose gardens flourished behind fences he'd repaired. Not everyone looked hostile, but the uncertainty was palpable. "Mr. Rigg," the judge continued, "you stand accused of being the outlaw Robert Riggs, wanted for train robbery and associated crimes. How do you answer these charges?" Beau stepped forward, removing his hat with the respectful dignity that had characterized all his interactions in Sundown Bluff. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent square. "Your Honor, I am Robert Beauregard Rigg. I did ride with the gang described in that wanted poster. I participated in some of the crimes they committed, though not in the ways that poster suggests." A collective gasp ran through the crowd. Despite the evidence against him, many people had apparently held on to hope that this was all a case of mistaken identity. Beau's admission shattered those hopes, replacing them with the harsh reality of his criminal past. "You admit to being an outlaw?" Judge Harrison pressed. "I admit to making choices during a dark period of my life that I've regretted every day since," Beau replied steadily. "But I also want this community to know the full truth, not just the version that fits on a wanted poster." Tom Henderson pushed forward from the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "Are you saying the railroad is lying about what you did?" "I'm saying the railroad is telling part of the truth," Beau answered without flinching, "but not all of it." Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence as murmurs of confusion swept through the assembly. "Mr. Rigg, perhaps you could explain exactly what role you played in these alleged crimes." Beau's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "After the war, I couldn't settle into normal life. The nightmares, the anger, they followed me everywhere I went. I fell in with other veterans who felt the same way, men who'd been broken by what we'd seen and done." "That doesn't excuse robbery," someone called out from the crowd. "No, it doesn't," Beau agreed. "Nothing excuses the choices I made. But for those 2 years, I convinced myself we were fighting a different kind of war, taking money from railroad companies that were getting rich, while families like ours struggled to survive." Cordelia watched the crowd's reaction carefully. Some faces showed understanding. There were plenty of veterans in Sundown Bluff who'd struggled with their own demons after the war. Others remained skeptical, waiting to hear something that might justify the serious accusations. "The poster mentions deaths," Judge Harrison said quietly. "Lawmen killed during these robberies." This was the moment Cordelia had been dreading. Beau's expression grew heavy, with a guilt she'd seen him carry since the day they met. "2 men died during jobs my gang pulled," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the square. "Deputy sheriffs doing their jobs, trying to protect other people's property. Their deaths are something I'll carry for the rest of my life." "Did you kill them?" The question came from Mrs. Patterson, her voice shaking with emotion. "No, ma'am, but I was there. I was part of the gang that created the situation where killing happened. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of their families, that makes me responsible." The silence that followed was deafening. Cordelia could feel the weight of the community's judgment settling over them like a shroud. This was the moment when public opinion would crystallize, determining whether Beau would face justice with their support or their condemnation. Judge Harrison studied the crowd before speaking again. "Mr. Rigg, what have you done since leaving that gang?" "I've tried to live an honest life, Your Honor. For 5 years, I've worked legitimate jobs, helped communities where I could, and attempted to make amends for the harm I caused." Beau's voice strengthened slightly. "I know that doesn't bring back the men who died or return the money that was stolen, but it's the only kind of justice I could create for myself." "And in Sundown Bluff specifically?" "I've tried to be useful, fixed what was broken, helped where I was needed, and treated every person in this community with the respect they deserved." "Including my daughter," Charles Vaughan said suddenly, his voice carrying across the square with unexpected clarity. Every head turned toward the banker, whose face had gone pale but determined. He stepped forward, still holding the legal documents that could end Beau's freedom. "Your Honor," Charles continued, I've spent this week convinced that Mr. Rigg was a threat to my family's safety and reputation. But watching him work, seeing how he's treated my children, observing the man he's chosen to be, rather than the man he once was, I find myself questioning whether justice is always served by punishment. The crowd buzzed with surprise. Charles Vaughan's endorsement carried enormous weight in Sundown Bluff, and his public change of heart represented a significant shift in the proceedings. "Mr. Vaughan," Judge Harrison said carefully, "are you saying you no longer support the charges against Mr. Rigg?" Charles looked at his daughter, then at Bo, his expression reflecting the internal struggle that had been tearing him apart. "I'm saying that I've seen enough of this man's character to believe he deserves a chance to continue proving who he's become, rather than being condemned for who he used to be." With deliberate ceremony, Charles Vaughan tore the legal documents in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like autumn leaves. The gesture sent a shock through the assembled crowd, but before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the confusion. "Well, I'll be damned, Bo Rigg standing trial in a public square. Never thought I'd see the day." All eyes turned toward the speaker, a lean man in his 50s, who'd approached from the edge of the crowd with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His face was weathered by years of hard living, but his bearing suggested authority and intelligence. "Sam Garrett," Bo said quietly, his voice mixing surprise with wariness. "Hello, Bo," Garrett replied. "Looks like you could use a character witness." The wedding ring that Judge Harrison produced from his vest pocket gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as he held it up for the crowd to see. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth by years of wear, and it belonged to the railroad detective Sullivan's deceased wife. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said solemnly, "before we proceed with your accusations against Mr. Rigg, I think this assembly should hear about the letter you received last week, the one that brought you to Sundown Bluff." Sullivan's confident demeanor flickered for the first time since the proceedings began. "Your Honor, I'm not sure how that's relevant to—" "I'll determine what's relevant," Judge Harrison interrupted firmly. "Please read the letter to the assembly." With obvious reluctance, Sullivan withdrew a folded paper from his coat pocket. His voice was steady, but lacked its earlier conviction as he began to read. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, I hope this letter finds you well. I write to inform you that I have information regarding the train robberies of 1,867 to 1,869, specifically concerning the man you've been seeking known as Robert Riggs." Cordelia felt Bo tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Around the square, the crowd leaned forward with renewed interest. Sullivan continued reading. "The man you seek is not the leader you believe him to be, nor is he responsible for the deaths that occurred during those incidents. I have evidence that will exonerate him of the most serious charges, but I require assurance that he will receive fair treatment before I come forward." "And who signed that letter, Mr. Sullivan?" Judge Harrison prompted. "Samuel Garrett," Sullivan replied reluctantly. A gasp ran through the crowd. Even in Sundown Bluff, people knew the name Samuel Garrett, the notorious outlaw leader who disappeared years earlier, leaving his gang scattered and his crimes unsolved. "Mr. Garrett arrived in town this morning," Judge Harrison announced. "He's been waiting in my chambers, and I believe it's time we heard what he has to say." The crowd murmured with excitement and apprehension as a figure emerged from the courthouse. Samuel Garrett was a lean man in his 50s, his face weathered by years of hard living, but his bearing still commanding. He moved with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being watched, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Bo. "Hello, Bo," Garrett said simply. "Sam," Bo replied, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Gentlemen," Judge Harrison intervened, "perhaps you could share with this assembly the true nature of your association and the events that led to these charges." Garrett nodded, addressing the crowd with the confidence of a man who'd finally decided to tell the truth. "Robert Rigg rode with my gang for 2 years, that much is true. But he was never a willing participant in violence, and he certainly never killed anyone. The wanted poster says otherwise." Sullivan interjected. The wanted poster is wrong, Garrett replied bluntly. Bo here joined us after the war because he was hurting and angry and didn't know what else to do with himself. But every time we planned a job that might involve shooting, he found reasons to stay with the horses or create diversions that kept people out of harm's way. Can you prove this? Judge Harrison asked. I can. Garrett reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather journal. I kept records of everything who did what, when they did it, and how the money was divided. Bo's share was always smaller because he insisted on limiting his involvement to the actual taking of railroad funds. No violence, no threats against passengers, no shooting at lawmen. Sullivan's face was growing red with frustration. Even if that's true, he still participated in federal crimes. The railroad wants justice. The railroad wants someone to blame, Garrett corrected. And they've been so focused on finding Bo that they never bothered looking for the real killers. Who were? Judge Harrison prompted. The Morrison brothers, no relation to our good sheriff here. They were part of the gang for 6 months before Bo and I threw them out for being too violent. After we split up, they kept using our methods and our reputation to cover their own crimes. Garrett's expression hardened. Last I heard, they were operating down in Mexico, still trading on the fear our gang's name created. Cordelia watched Bo's face as these revelations unfolded. She could see the mixture of relief and residual guilt warring in his expression, the burden of years spent believing himself responsible for deaths he hadn't caused. Mr. Rigg, Judge Harrison said, turning to Bo directly, do you have anything to add to Mr. Garrett's testimony? Bo stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. I'm grateful to Sam for coming forward, but I don't want to hide behind technicalities. I did break the law. I did steal money that wasn't mine. And I did make choices that put other people in danger, even if I tried to minimize that danger. But you've also spent 5 years trying to make amends, Judge Harrison observed, working honest jobs, helping communities, living peacefully. Yes, sir, I have. The judge looked out over the assembled crowd, his gaze settling briefly on Cordelia before returning to Bo. In light of Mr. Garrett's testimony and the evidence he's provided, I'm dismissing the most serious charges against you. However, you did participate in federal crimes, and that can't be ignored entirely. Cordelia's heart clenched, fearing the worst despite the apparent turn in Bo's favor. Therefore, Judge Harrison continued, I'm sentencing you to 5 years of community service, to be served right here in Sundown Bluff, under the supervision of our local authorities. You'll continue working honest jobs, contributing to our community's welfare, and proving that redemption is possible for those who genuinely seek it. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs, some approving, others clearly disappointed by the lack of dramatic justice. But Cordelia heard none of it over the sound of her own heart, hammering with relief and something that might have been joy. Bo turned to look at her, his grey eyes bright with a hope she'd never seen there before. Looks like I'll be staying in Sundown Bluff for a while, he said quietly. Good, she replied, not caring who might overhear. I was hoping you would. From somewhere in the crowd, she heard her father's resigned sigh, but it was accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like relief. Even Charles Vaughan, it seemed, had grown fond of the man who'd brought such unexpected changes to their household. The wedding ring in Judge Harrison's hand caught the light as he prepared to declare the proceedings closed. But Cordelia was already thinking of another ring, entirely one that might someday symbolize new beginnings rather than old endings. The new family photograph sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, replacing the formal portrait that had dominated the Vaughan parlor for so many years. This image captured a different kind of family one that had grown not through blood alone but through choice, commitment, and the courage to embrace unexpected love. Cordelia stood beside Bo in the photograph, her hand resting on his arm, with the comfortable familiarity of 6 months of marriage. Her wedding dress had been simple rather than elaborate, chosen more for practicality than fashion, but her smile outshone any amount of silk or lace. Bo wore his best suit purchased, specifically for the occasion with money earned from his carpentry business, and his expression held the quiet contentment of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. Thomas and Sarah flanked them on either side, both taller than they'd been during that eventful week when everything changed. Thomas now worked alongside Bo most afternoons, learning the skills of carpentry and fence building with the enthusiasm of youth. Sarah had blossomed into a young woman whose romantic nature had found practical outlet in helping Cordelia manage their expanding household. Charles Vaughan stood behind his children, his hand resting on Cordelia's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of acceptance rather than possession. The banker's conversion hadn't been immediate or complete, but he'd gradually come to appreciate Bo's steady character and obvious devotion to his daughter. More importantly, he'd seen how happy Cordelia had become, a happiness that had less to do with material comfort and more to do with finding someone who valued her thoughts, respected her opinions, and encouraged her dreams. Even Jubilee had earned her place in the photograph, positioned near Bo's feet with an expression of dignified satisfaction. The donkey had become something of a town mascot, known for her ability to predict weather changes, locate lost items, and express opinions about everything from garden plantings to political candidates. Children brought her treats, adults consulted her about their problems, and she presided over the Vaughan household with the authority of someone who'd always known she belonged there. "Remember when you thought buying Bo was a joke?" Sarah asked, examining the photograph with the satisfaction of someone whose romantic predictions had proven accurate. "I remember thinking I was purchasing a week's labor," Cordelia replied, adjusting the frame to catch the afternoon light properly. "I had no idea I was investing in a lifetime of happiness." The happiness hadn't come without challenges. Bo's community service had required him to work on various town projects, rebuilding the schoolhouse after a fire, constructing a new bridge over Miller's Creek, helping establish the territorial library that Cordelia had championed. But each project had integrated him further into Sundown Bluff's social fabric, proving that redemption was possible for those willing to earn it. His carpentry business had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Bo's combination of military precision, artistic sensibility, and uncompromising honesty had attracted customers from neighboring towns. The wooden horse he'd carved for Cordelia had been the first of many pieces that now graced homes throughout the territory. Each commission told a story, captured a memory, or celebrated a milestone in someone's life. Mrs. Patterson ordered another rocking chair. Bo announced, entering the parlor with sawdust in his hair and satisfaction in his voice. "Says the first one was so comfortable she needs a matching pair." "That's wonderful," Cordelia said, though she was more interested in the way Bo's face lit up when he talked about his work than in Mrs. Patterson's furniture needs. "Did you tell her about the delivery time?" 6 weeks. Same as always. Good work can't be rushed." Bo settled into his favorite chair-rone he'd built specifically for the parlor's proportions and accepted the coffee that Sarah brought him with automatic courtesy. "Thomas did excellent work on the joinery today. Boy's got natural talent with his hands." "He's got a good teacher," Cordelia observed, noting how pride softened Bo's expression when he talked about her brother's progress. The family dynamics had evolved in ways none of them could have predicted. Bo's presence had given Thomas a male influence that complemented their father's business-focused approach to life. Sarah had found in Bo someone who took her romantic notions seriously while helping her channel them into practical directions. Even Charles Vaughan had benefited from having someone around who understood the value of honest work and wasn't impressed by financial success alone. "Judge Harrison stopped by the workshop today," Bo continued. "Says the territorial governor is interested in commissioning some furniture for the new Capitol building." "That's quite an honor," Cordelia said, though she wasn't surprised. Bo's reputation had spread far beyond Sundown Bluff, carried by satisfied customers and the judge's own endorsement of his character. "It is," Bo agreed, "though I told him I'd need to discuss it with my business partner before making any commitments." Cordelia smiled at the designation. She'd gradually taken over the administrative aspects of Bo's carpentry business, handling orders, managing finances, and coordinating deliveries. It was work that utilized her education and organizational skills while supporting something she believed in deeply. What did you tell him? That we'd consider it if he could wait until after the baby arrives. The casual mention of their expected child due in 3 months still had the power to take Cordelia's breath away. After so many years of wondering if she'd ever find love, the idea of creating a family with Bo felt like a gift beyond anything she'd dared to hope for. Speaking of the baby, Sarah interjected with barely contained excitement. "I've finished the cradle quilt. Would you like to see it?" The quilt was a masterpiece of careful stitching and thoughtful design, incorporating fabric from meaningful Sorcesa piece of Cordelia's wedding dress, material from Bo's first shirt made in Sundown Bluff, scraps from Thomas's outgrown clothes, and squares cut from their mother's favorite tablecloth. It told the story of their blended family in thread and color, creating something new from pieces of their shared history. "It's perfect," Cordelia said, running her fingers over the intricate patterns. "Our child is lucky to have such a devoted aunt. All our children are lucky," Bo said quietly, his hand finding Cordelia's and squeezing gently. "They'll grow up knowing that families are built on love and choice, not just blood and obligation." As evening settled over Sundown Bluff, the Vaughan Rigg household prepared for another peaceful night. Jubilee claimed her favorite spot near the kitchen stove. Charles Vaughan retreated to his study with papers that couldn't wait until morning, and Thomas and Sarah argued good-naturedly about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Cordelia and Bo stood together on the front porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The town spread below them looked much the same as it had on that fateful day when she'd impulsively raised her hand at the labor auction, but everything felt different now. She'd found her place not by conforming to others' expectations, but by having the courage to follow her heart. "Any regrets?" Bo asked, as he did sometimes when the evening light made him philosophical. "Only that I waited so long to take a chance on something real," Cordelia replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "What about you?" "I regret the years I spent running from the possibility of redemption," he said, his arm tightening around her. "But I'm grateful they led me here, to this moment, to this life we've built together." The new family photograph watched over them from its place of honor, capturing not just their faces, but the love that had transformed a banker's rebellious daughter and a cowboy seeking redemption into something neither could have become alone. Sometimes the most precious things couldn't be bought with money. They had to be earned with patience, courage, and the willingness to believe that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness. In the distance, the church bell chimed the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a benediction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that love could indeed conquer the obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But tonight, they had everything they needed: each other, their chosen family, and the knowledge that sometimes the best investments were the ones that couldn't be calculated in dollars and cents.